neither new normality nor old normality, revolution or barbarism. There are diably interesting times. The slogans expire with an amazing speed. The oaths of the beginning of yesterday give way to today's pragmatism. Slogans that seem to have been buried for years emerge spectrally from his tomb, and the most absolute collective amnesia reigns. Does anyone remember, for example, the anti-fascist alert of a year and a half ago? If we have even seen neoliberals convert to Keynesianism. Of course, it is one of the virtues of the crises to show how, deep down, the professions of faith of the different gangs of the bourgeoisie are diluted when it comes to shouldering the maintenance of this criminal system. And in this crime they participate collectively, with equal guilt, all its representatives. If it is possible to talk about guilt to refer to a class whose mere existence is already, to paraphrase the incorruptible, an attack on freedom. From the jester occupied by the Oval Office, it doesn't matter when this is read, to the last prankster put into a union bureaucrat. As Engels said, the revolution is the only absolute that dialectic leaves standing, and the crisis, a dialectical counterpart of the revolution, is but the manifestation of the bloody member in which the last class society has been entangled in the absence of it. It is, for that very reason, the permanent and fundamental argument to recover the absolutism of the revolution and return to turn it as an engine of progress. The COVID-19 pandemic has made present the omni-mod structural crisis of class society in the heart of the beast, generally alien to the sufferings of the imperial peripheries and their own inner peripheries. Let's take the floor, then, to Barman's bearded man. Let's take advantage of the crisis to examine, from the absolute point of view of the revolution, the positions that the various classes of society have adopted before it and the tasks that correspond to revolutionary communists around the globe. Europe, what are you doing? If our readers perform a simple memory exercise, they will be able to remember how before the health crisis, in November last year, de Gaulle's party occupied by the Élysée proclaimed the brain death of NATO while putting his hands increasingly brazenly in Libya, trying to counteract the slice that other regional scavengers such as Russia and Turkey are taking out of the civil war between the rest of the Libyan state and the warlord Khalifa Haftar. The choice of this enclave by France to satisfy its predatory appetites is not, on the other hand, symptomatic of anything other than the French weakness to conduct an independent foreign policy. Being the border with Russia guarded by the mercenaries of the Enhanced Forward Presence, EFP, of NATO, created by the Warsaw Summit of 3 years ago, the French have naturally gravitated towards the powder keg of the Eastern Mediterranean, an open flank in the American rear after the Syrian fiasco. Turkey, another that dances so much, had already tried to tear Macron with his repeated offensives on Syrian soil during 2019, carried out outside the EU and with the tacit approval of the United States. United States, aware of the convenience of a regional actor in the Eastern Mediterranean who acts independently of the European leaders, this was in fact the casus belli that led Macron to presume NATO dead. In this situation, and given the continuous failures of the Sultanate in the region, France could feel endorsed its traditional aspirations to unite the faltering EU as an independent imperialist pole. The pandemic has accelerated these trends, incendiarily combining itself with the already dry meadow of the old normal. The imperialist hyenas have seen in the general destabilization of friends and enemies a juicy opportunity to make their August. An alarming example of this escalation has been the maritime clash between those two NATO members, France and Turkey, off the Libyan coast in June of this year. Regarding this conflict, David Schenker, Yankee Secretary of State for Middle East Affairs, has regretted that the EU is only concerned about Turkish interference in Libya while ignoring the Russian and Egyptian, undisguised taking part that forced the indignant exit from Paris of the arms embargo operation that NATO holds over the North African country, contributing to further destabilize U.S. control over the region. And while those responsible lament the Syrianization of the conflict, throwing the stone and hiding their hand, the Libyan people continue to pay with their blood for the crimes of these birds of prey and their regional allies. The North African rimland is on the rise, as a privileged arena of the increasingly intense inter-imperialist contradictions that order regional life. Perhaps it is difficult to subscribe, with Spickman, that whoever dominates the Mediterranean Strip will dominate the world, because geopolitics, that science of imperialism, is, from the point of view of Marxism, limited and unable to respond to more complex and elevated historical phenomena, such as the World Proletarian Revolution, RPM. But, precisely because of the absence of this, the moment of truth of geopolitics shines with peculiar intensity and can offer a certain vault of understanding of the evolution of international politics. France, although it lacks the strategic projection of other powers, knows that any claim of a European empire goes through its consolidation on the northern shore of the African continent. The reinforcement of the French military presence in the eastern Mediterranean, according to the Turkish interference in Greek and Cypriot waters, another flammable gas drum where Ankara declared to be willing to resolve the Manu-Militari issue, goes, of course, in the same line, as well as the Rust-Macronian sponsorship of Beirut after the explosion that shook the Lebanese capital last August. But, as we said, the intense French foreign activity could only be consolidated at the expense of the EU. Not coincidentally, Germany has already shown its disagreement with the Mediterranean policy of its ally, the decomposition of the Western imperialist bloc, while it seemed to leave a minimum gap of strategic independence to the EU, broke the very raison d'etre of this imperialist federation, aborting any independent imperial consolidation in advance. With the approval of the reconstruction funds this July, certain voices have evoked the glories of the post-war period, greeting the deal as a new Marshall Plan. Beyond the fact that with the negotiation of the funds the EU has clearly shown itself as what it actually is, an imperialist dividend distribution committee, the Marshallian metaphor has very short legs. And the European Recovery Plan was vertebrated by the construction of the welfare state and a clear foreign policy sponsored by the USA, whose first major premiere was the Korean War. What's left of it? First of all, the Russian bear threatens that has traditionally justified the military discipline of European states through NATO. Not in vain, representatives of this organization have taken advantage of the COVID-19 crisis to emphasize the importance of military capabilities and their orderly containment, a sinister declaration of intent about the new normalities that are to come. On the other hand, a spectral social pact for reconstruction that comes to try to win back the social sectors hit by the pandemic without charging the accounts of big capital. This spin-off is precisely the thread of the revolution that gave historical projection to the original Marshall. As several openologists have insisted straying in recent months, and of what the avant-garde should take good note, the U.S. The United States does not face an ideological enemy today such as the social imperialist USSR and what it evoked as a byproduct of the proletarian revolution in Russia. All that is at stake today is the distribution of areas of influence and the sources of the imperialist super benefits among the different scavengers. What yesterday united the front of the world counter-revolution, whose constitution as a more or less cohesive imperialist entente was, in fact, a milestone, historical for having in front of the RPM, is now separated by the selfish interests of each national bourgeoisie in struggle, opportunely reconciled when it was a question of liquidating the revolutionary threat and today focused, more than anything, on projecting itself outward and guaranteeing its internal stability. In this context of armed peace, it is necessary to locate the incidents of Fachota that are to come and, also, those scenarios on the edge of the knife, such as Belarusian or the resumed conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Nagorno-Karabakh, in which international actors hesitate to intervene, aware of the unpredictable escalation that would entail the rupture of the current and precarious strategic balance. The whole strategy that the imperialist heads can think of today does not go beyond the historic skein of links that their policy has so far conveyed and the breaks in that of their rivals, logic that leads directly to war. But this constitutes, despite everything, a strategic line. And those who are proving to live up to their interests as number one of the bloody imperialist podium and as a serious aspiring to debunk it are, respectively, the United States and China. In fact, the Treaty of January of this year, which was said to put an end to the trade war between these bandits, was, in fact, a not inconsiderable tactical adjustment that would allow both powers to continue to accumulate forces for their long-term struggle. The United States would separate the EU from the Chinese markets, secure strategic imports such as aluminum and, in return, substantially expand its industrial and agricultural exports to the Asian giant, the branches most decimated by the tariff pulse and that Trump had promised to protect. As far as China is concerned, it would also weaken the regional enemies that most hinder their free movement through their neighborhood, India, Vietnam, Japan, and Taiwan. With the outset of the health crisis, the treaty jumped through the air, forcing the U.S. The United States, to a greater extent than its Asian counterpart, to try to save the furniture quickly. With the collapse of trade, the justification of the agreement vanished, but it was the initial Chinese destabilization due to the health crisis that precipitated the escalation through which the U.S. is trying to speed up the times and regain the advantage over their rival. The mutual accusations about the responsibility of the pandemic, the diplomacy of the masks, the reciprocal closure of embassies, and the military deployment from both shores of the Pacific are the milestones that have been marking the failure of the Yankee tactic to take oxygen, neutralize its various open fronts, and regain the initiative. Naturally, it does not change the general meaning to which the conflict was heading in August of last year. The United States withdrew from the 1987 agreement with the social imperialist USSR, which limited the use of intermediate-range missiles, but it does represent another important setback in the North American roadmap to the Pacific, further destabilizing its already dented rear. If all this makes the Yankee Empire lose the strategic initiative, vigorous Chinese imperialism will be able to hang the sinister medal to the merit of achieving what no other power has achieved in decades. The oppressed peoples and imperialism. This does not prevent the superpower from continuing to have ample room for maneuver, even in spite of the allies who conveyed their global hegemony. In the Middle East, the agreement of the century has officially brought together two great friends from the United States. The United States, Israel, and the Emirates, and a sinister entente directed towards the containment of Iran, another solution on the go in the face of the American failure to short-tie the Islamic Republic. But the reason that has accelerated the vision of peace was, without a doubt, to avoid more firewood in the regional fire and interrupt the annexation of the West Bank by the Zionist state, or, more likely, to pause it. The concept of peace through weakness and withdrawal, Netanyahu said after the agreement, has disappeared. Israel has retaliated with several days of bombing of Gaza, but those who have been authentically portrayed once again have long been the Palestinian leaders and their boss Mahmoud Abbas. If the agreements between Trump and Netanyahu of February had already put against the strings of negotiation strategy with the blood of the Palestinian people, this summer's treaty has given it the tip, definitively liquidating the traditional structure of the negotiations, the official hostility of the Arab world against Israel, and the doctrine of the two states as it was configured since the 1993 agreements. The tragic fate has reached, after all, the PLO, the Palestinian leaders themselves, for having liquidated their popular resistance movement for decades of realpolitik, are now without a grip to hold on to be able to continue their policy of alliance with the Israeli bourgeoisie, which has finally achieved its desired goal for decades, to be the only interlocutor in the area, without having to take into account its Arab sister. And the communists must draw two lessons from this chronicle of a death announced, that the People's War is the only way to conquer the freedom of the Palestinian people, and that the Palestinian bourgeoisie is terrified just to think about this perspective. The closest that has been to the political logic of the People's War was, probably, with the First Intifada. During it, the spontaneous emergence of nuclei of what we would call the practical vanguard, the popular committees, and their link with the bulk of the Arab population, mobilizing it through the shock forces and organizing it in various military actions, was enough to give serious problems to the Zionist state for 6 years, despite its lack of coordination and dispersion. An authentic vanguard party would have gotten to work immediately, centralizing, organizing, and enhancing the armed sea of masses that carried out the strategic objective of demolition of the State of Israel. The Unified National Command, UNM, constituted to coordinate the actions and quickly hegemonized by the PLO, was, however, the one who did the most to redirect the movement towards a comfortable negotiating position for the small Palestinian bourgeoisie through a criminal barter. That of the popular movement, conveniently domesticated by the pacifist ideas of the UNM and Al-Fatah by the negotiating table in Oslo. Without an independent revolutionary line, the only strategy in which the popular committees could become part was, neither more nor less, the only existing one, the one that was already at hand, the petty bourgeois liquidation line of alliance with the Zionist bourgeoisie under international arbitration. And there is no room for more armed masses than those that have to be disarmed in exchange for the handshake between Arafat and Rabin. Today, that framework lies broken into pieces, and it seems unlikely that the Palestinian people will rise up in a third intifada, demoralized and disorganized. They are disconnected from their own insurrectional traditions, educated for decades in the conciliatory cretinism of Al-Fatah, Abbas, and Sai. These same criminals are the ones who now give themselves to pitiful speeches at the UN, plunged into absolute discredit. 5. Their consequent inconsistency of class has not only pushed them to abjure from Palestinian emancipation, but also to self-liquidate as a party. That is the balance of, at least, 30 years of pragmatism and political realism, which is nothing other than the deliberate renunciation of freedom that they themselves long for. Don't say I can't. Say, I don't want to. The only revolutionary slogan that fits is, as we have already said on previous occasions, the internationalist alliance of the Palestinian people with the Israeli proletariat and the violent destruction of the Zionist state. And if, as Lenin said, the fight against imperialism is an empty phrase if it is not linked to the fight against opportunism, the first task of the Arab proletariat is the denunciation of its own conciliatory leaders. On the other hand, the oppressive Israeli yoke and the guerrilla traditions so present in the Palestinian people, we think, again, of the Intifada, but also in the daily and sporadic resistance against the occupation, provide a more than favorable context for the Arab communists to endow the process of mass coverage, linking the fight against opportunism to the strategic organization of the war against the Zionist polizont and to the organization of the masses through it. In fact, and anticipating the criticisms of the realist revisionist, this is not a utopia, nor a chimera, nor an idealistic dream, because it has already been done. Hamas emerged, precisely, applying this line against the conciliation of the PLO and its betrayal of the First Intifada, placing the annihilation of Israel as the strategic objective and the general armament of the people as a means. That the Islamists of Hamas have subsequently traveled the same path as Arafat's party does not mean that the doctrine of the two states and the policy of alliance with the Zionist bourgeoisie are in the DNA of Palestinian opportunism. But, de facto, Hamas once appropriated the model of the Leninist party, in which the party identifies with the organized revolutionary movement, only put at the service of another kind. And such a perspective in the right hands, unthinkable as long as the Arab vanguard does not emancipate itself from the opportunistic ideas of its bourgeoisie or the Israeli proletariat is emancipated from Zionist chauvinism, it would open the doors to the reconstitution of the Communist Party on the direct basis of the implementation of the People's War. This scenario would be close to the thesis of the Maoist left of reconstituting militarized communist parties, which, although qualified as insufficient in general by the LR, does make tactical sense in the particular Palestinian situation, where the really existing war of occupation demands to be transformed into a revolutionary civil war. But this, we insist, only makes sense as the way in which the universal perspective of the ideological and political reconstitution of communism is concretized on the tangled Palestinian soil. No more flattering is the panorama in Latin America, where the cycle of socialism of the 21st century is coming to an end. In Venezuela, the imperialist offensive started last year seems, for the moment, to be extinguished. His embers, a crazy academy of mercenaries composed of a handful of former American soldiers and opponents, and a parody remake of Bahia Cochinos, tried to open, in May, a beachhead on the coast of the Caribbean country to facilitate a non-existent invasion, although always suggested by the graduate of the Oval Office and his regional mastiffs. More than a triumph of Chavismo, the result of the game must be read as tables, since the rejection of the offensive has not been due to the popular mobilization, null during and after the episode. In fact, in this sense of technical tie, the recent pardon that the Venezuelan president has granted to more than 100 opponents, including Guaido, in search of the supreme commitment for peace and reconciliation must be understood. For its class position, the government prefers to arrange a compromise with the former vendettas before facing the prospect of appealing the Venezuelan people to the civil war against the agents of American imperialism, a context in which the role of the army may not be so clear. In other words, it is not directly up to Maduro and the PSUV to neutralize the coming offensives of imperialism, but to the fidelity of the crude military marrow of the Venezuelan state. And to such an extent comes the bourgeois stupidity of the Bolivarian government that has held conversations with the resurrected caporals open to participate in the elections of December 6th. And Maduro, by the way, wanted to invite the European Union and the UN as vigilantes of the transparency of the elections. That's the anti-imperialism of Bolivarian socialism. And if we want to intuit the panorama that would open up with military disaffection, it is enough to look further south, to Bolivia. The average opportunist and little nuns of the charity of various species celebrated it is not known what a few weeks ago, when the MAS was re-elected at the polls by a large majority. Parliamentary cretinism and its things, a wet paper weighs more than the authentic demonstration of strength that the reaction has been deploying in Bolivia for a year. Remember, it was the intervention of the police and the army that precipitated the resignation of Evo Morales at the end of 2019. The petty pull around whether or not there was electoral fraud was all the fight that this socialist knew how to present, and La Paz appealed the accusations before nothing less than the sinister Organization of American States, a faithful dog of Yankee imperialism, before resigning and allowing, so to speak, with the leadership of the coup General 8, pacification and the maintenance of stability. Naturally, the pigs in uniform lack time to stop being with the people and entrust themselves to repress the social movements, eminently the union and indigenous, which demonstrated in favor of the former president. These protests revealed, by the way, the flimsy of the plurinational state, candy wrapper of the indigenous problem and the land problem. The agrarian revolution by the coup of the law of the first indigenous president could not avoid the concentration of land in the south of the country, where poverty was also concentrated. This political artifact, far from radically solving both issues in the plebeian way, which Marx would say was limited to suspending them ad calendas Graecas in the tyndal of corporate representativeness. The indigenous entered as represented in a state pact with the Creoles, nominally, the great bourgeoisie of the mine and export, receiving certain social benefits in exchange for the stability that turned Bolivia, during the decade we closed this year, into one of the most attractive Latin American countries for foreign investments. This system, the secret of Morales' success in the 15 years of his mandate, was also the secret of his downfall. The Chupacerios Inés and her henchmen did nothing but stretch the rod towards the other flank that opened the plurinational state, eastern, urban Bolivia, susceptible of seeing in its associate of the mountains a burden at a time when the Bolivian bureaucratic bourgeoisie, well represented in the government and the state, feared a shrinkage in its part of the cake. The lonely column of indigenous people marching in La Paz to defend the MAS, orphan of some leaders who did not even deign to present a battle, was the best example of the balance of this socialism of the 21st century. Exacerbation of social conflict and expeditious way to the reaction of the cross and the saber, all leaving the secular problems of the Andean country unsolved. After such a banquet, will Damocles Luis Arce or the soldier who holds the sword over his head dance better, if he decides to take La Paz, and this time by assault? End Jim Crow, Black Lives Matter and the tasks of the black proletariat. All these tensions have also had their explosive correlates within the imperialist states themselves. In the U.S. In the United States, the police have reminded the black population, once again, of their caste past with the murder of George Floyd, adding in the following days new names to the endless history of domestic victims of American imperialism. The Black Lives Matter, BLM, movement escalated strongly during the following weeks, and an escalation of tension that we have not seen since 2014. On this occasion, the movement has explicitly linked its demands to the fall of the Republican government, unlike 6 years ago, when the White House was occupied by the war criminal Obama and has forced Donald Trump to resort to the Insurrection Act of 1807, declaring the curfew and deploying the army as a real occupation force in its own territory. If we analyze the movement from an ethical, objective, and external perspective, starting from the international context that we have hastily reviewed, the significance of the BLM is clear. It has posed an important threat to the internal stability of the country, especially dangerous at a time when Uncle Sam was forced to frantically accelerate the rhythms of his foreign policy and still disoriented by the initial invitation of the crisis. This speaks to us, first of all, of the tendency ally insurrectional logic that translucent the movement, mobilizing the sectors of the black population traditionally already framed in political and social organizations, and also those normally unrelated to politics, which we can call deep masses of the class, although rather punctually and sporadically directly confronting the forces of law enforcement and setting fire to some of the most distinguished totems of the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. And it also explains one of the features that has most powerfully attracted the attention of the phenomenon. The BLM has been covered, from day one, by a wide and friendly media and business coverage, with little black squares and merchandising for the activist Instagrammer. In other words, the Yankee bourgeoisie has smelled the danger that a home crisis of these dimensions poses for the delicate external situation of the North American country. It is not that he opposed Trump's international policies. The moderate Biden has already made it clear on numerous occasions that he will bet equally and even more energetically on economic nationalism and the siege of China. But that Republicans have been particularly clumsy to manage the tidal wave of contradictions that shakes the internal life of the country. Such is all the political depth that the movement can have in the absence of the revolutionary class capable of incorporating the black masses into the general struggle against imperialism. However, the genuine Marxist approach to BLM, like any other social phenomenon, can only include the subjective, internal, emic factor, if you like, as an essential part of the understanding of its class nature and the projection of the future it has. In the core of the ideological conceptions of the American black movement, there are two key ideas, at least since the 60s and the time of the civil rights movements: the black community as a subject of political action and the encryption of the legitimacy of the state to whether or not it satisfies its demands. In parallel to the conquest of their political rights, the currents that postulate an objective beyond emerge. In the economic and social self-management of the black community, we think, for example, of the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X, with a strong burden of distrust towards integration with whites after the end of the separate but equal doctrine. This turn is symptomatic that, at that point, the black issue as a democratic bourgeois problem was already behind, based on which the Sixth Congress of the Comintern, 1928, had recognized the black nation in the Black Belt and its right to self-determination, and was reduced to a social problem, which, capitalism being the dominant mode of production and put on the table the socialist revolution, can only mean classist. Significantly, the March of Washington was followed by the historic revolts in the impoverished neighborhoods of Harlem and Watts. But, in turn, both in 1960 and in 2020, the class experience immediately accessible to the spontaneous movement, including the black movement, is the experience of the proletariat as an economic class, as a class with a conscience in itself, and that, interned in the imperialist era, and all the more so in its first power, is the experience, baggage and institutions of the working class integrated into the bourgeois state and of the working class aristocracy as an imperialist co-manager, with its mass institution in the Union. The black movement, on the other hand, found in the community the basis on which to accumulate the forces to translate into political representation and a quota of participation in the state. Building community had to be, therefore, a substantive activity in the framing of the contemporary black movement, as its own and specific accumulation of spontaneous forces, as a direct translation of what was the historic constitution of the old-type Workers' Party on the basis of the spontaneous movement of the proletariat. But what for the labor movement was an accumulation of forces from which it emerged, contradictory and historically, its superior form of classist organization, the Communist Party. In the case of the black movement, is an end in itself with no greater horizon than the one already offered by the old imperialist normality, representatives in Congress. It is this lack of a genuine beyond, perhaps, the reason why the BLM has exploded as a libertarian and anarchizing mass movement, reactive prolongation of those community traditions and atonement of opportunistic sins in the black movement, if we are allowed to paraphrase it. The ephemeral Capitol Hill organized protest, CHOP, of Seattle, which seemed to carry out all the self-managed cop-free fantasies, had no other outcome than the disappearance after the civic dialogue with the head of the police department, the only possible end having no other objective than to press from below to reduce police spending and guarantee social programs in black neighborhoods, all by invoking the First Amendment and the right to protest. The CHOP experiment, even under the standards of the historical logic in which it is intertwined, the masses-state dialectic, is far from being consistent. And it is that the goal to which he objectively pointed, to assume the state functions, which range from the administration of supply and basic social services to the organization of violence, requires, according to its own logic, the education and training of the masses in these functions, to know whose access they have vetoed by the division of labor. And when the de facto leaders of the CHOP of the type of Nikita Olivier, professional activist and former candidate for mayor of Seattle, spread and reaffirm their horizontalist and communitarian prejudices, they are not only cynically renouncing their own responsibility, but also aborting in advance the spontaneous emergency of leaders from among the masses, and whose timid attempts to stand out and put themselves at the head of the resistance movement were publicly disowned as warlords by the demonstrators themselves. Such is the democratic result of horizontalism and pacifism, liquidation of the foundation of a genuine mass power, based on the general armament of the people and on the construction of institutions that allow their self-education in the art of governing. And this does not imply any betrayal. It is that the very notion of community cancels the different degrees of consciousness of the masses, subsuming them under a homogeneous and merely representable subject, natural counterpart of the institutions of the bourgeois state, and without another flight that, precisely, to be represented, in 1969 as in 2020, the black vote's fundamentally democratic, and the good Biden was the favorite of the black vote. From a negative point of view, in addition, this informs us of the frontal opposition of self-management ideas to the proletarian revolution, whose starting point lies precisely in the advanced sector of the class, in its avant-garde and in the resolution of the tasks that belong to this sphere of an ideological nature, and whose purpose is not representation, but directionality towards a conscious end. But for opportunism, as is known, the secret is in the mass. And, if in the absence of good bread they are cakes, revisionism is willing to buy even the unleavened bread of the petty bourgeois anarchism in order to receive the consecrated host of the spontaneous movement. In a recent statement, the SPUP of the Revolutionary Communist Party, United States of America, RCPUSA, said that the disbandment of the Trump-Pence fascist regime, replacing it by Biden, for whom the RCPUSA asked for the vote, was not in conflict with the uprisings of the masses against institutionalized white supremacy and police terror, but that it was about reinforcing the struggles through his unity. 10. In the end, the only strategy that fits in the head of revisionism on this or that side of the Atlantic is reduced to that, to tie the hands of the vanguard to the spontaneous mass movement, to the really existing struggles, and, incidentally, to postulate himself, or to the liberal mummy on duty, as is the case, as the best manager of the bourgeois state in the interest of the people. And for that it is of every point unnecessary that the mass movement is communist or that the state is the dictatorship of the proletariat. That is why revisionism and anarchism are two sides of the same coin, fed by the same ideological fetishes about a non-existent straight line between resistance and revolution, an idea refuted once again by the BLM, an explosive derivation of the health crisis. If the spontaneous movement is already independent of the bourgeoisie and bearer of the right ideas, how is that line different from petty bourgeois anarchism? What is the Leninist party necessary for then? What tasks are left for the dictatorship of the proletariat apart from a decaffeinated social program that can be assumed for any liberal bird with a minimum of state vision? It is enough with an old-style working-class party that groups the various struggles of the masses on a common front against the bourgeoisie. Or even with the anti-monopolistic sectors of the bourgeoisie, what does it matter? The assumption or not of the company to build it is all the difference between revisionism and anarchism, but this is only a difference of degree against the basic doctrinal community that both share about the fundamental springs of political action in any case below, and against of the requirements for the relaunch of the proletarian revolution and in the face of its net result, to prevent the vanguard from raising its head, subjecting it to the Progressive Party and endless social work in the neighborhood, in the squatted center, etc. The Communist Party is built from above, from the definition of the general line and the construction of the vanguard. It is that, if we are faithful to materialism, the ideas that can emerge from the spontaneous movement of the class, and more in a context of absolute liquidation of communism and crushing hegemony of opportunism, are none other than the ideas that reproduce their situation as such an exploited class, as a class that concentrates all the misery of modern society. 12. The black question has long ceased to be a special issue to become another ingredient of the general misery that plagues our class. And the first task of the avant-garde, if it wants to break the vicious circle of the struggle of resistance, is to rise itself to the equally general perspective of the RPM, and not to crawl before the bourgeois ideological artifacts that spontaneity engenders, precisely because, as the best son of Maoism teaches us, the Communist Party of Peru, the popular war is, basically, the military confrontation between the organized revolutionary movement, the Communist Party, and the spontaneous reformist movement, transmission belt of the bourgeois state. And this confrontation begins with the vanguard that strives to regain its revolutionary and independent conception of the world. This higher historical dialectic is the avant-garde party dialectic, in which the vanguard and the communist strategic horizon play the computer axis of the development of the revolutionary movement. In the imperialist countries, where the democratic revolution and the issue of the land are no longer politically on the agenda, there is no immediately revolutionary spontaneous movement that can be ridden and overwhelmed by the left. On the contrary, it must be consciously generated from the initiative of the avant-garde. Therefore, the imperative of the communists is, currently, to separate themselves from the spontaneous movement, against the permanent spontaneous temptation to merge into it or to organize it, and attend to the substantive tasks that belong to their immediate scope, the reconstitution of their revolutionary conception of the world and the construction of the vanguard, including their independent and clandestine organization. As a counterexample, the world crisis provided us, in the same North American country, with another preview of the sinister journey of the spontaneous movement, the taking of the streets by the anti-establishment right in spring. Making the flag of the protest against the containment measures of the pandemic, he has known, locally and spontaneously, and without any formal organization, to put the constituted, globalist and anti-national powers on the ropes. The most spectacular case has been, without a doubt, that of Michigan, where armed individuals have taken the Capitol and forced the Democrats to lighten the measures of confinement. These groups taint with the cream and flower of Yankee traditions, starting with the KKK and, more recently, with the alt-right and the armed militias that have proliferated since the time of Clinton. With Karen declaiming against the Democratic governor for denying him his right to a haircut, these groups have proven to be able to constitute the spearhead of a possible fascist movement, whose organization would be more or less feasible if any heretic detached from the establishment seriously proposed to capitalize it as something more than a fishing sting place of votes. Trump and consorts were rather in profile, avoiding linking to the movement despite mutual sympathy. The Rambos of Burger King from Michigan carried Trumpist paraphernalia. But it has not been, of course, due to political incapacity. From the Zionist lobby to the Chicago Boys, Yankee conservatism has a more than proven ability to wake up its ideological political cadres and have the appropriate transmission belts to organize the masses. And if both the BLM and the movements of the right demonstrate anything, it is the exhaustion of the mass state dialectic as a revolutionary platform and how, in conditions of the closed cycle and bourgeois offensive throughout the line, the spontaneous mass movement serves the reaction. Thus, logics and ways of proceeding originally born of the revolutionary bourgeoisie and the labor movement, the accumulation of forces, the seizure of power, or the capital, are today the common heritage of all factions of the capitalist class at all its levels, as well as the byproducts of the successive crises of those, such as anarchism or horizontalism. The white supremacist and Klansman Louis Beam is recognized as one of the first formulators of the leaderless resistance, the same anarchizing and liquidating conception with which the leaders of the BLM ideologically feed their representatives while asking for the vote for of the most murky criminal organizations on the planet, the Democratic Party. Iberian opportunism finds its green shoots. With regard to these lands, we are having to endure with redoubled crushing the insufferable litany of the national emergency, the unity and the parking of party differences under the very serene umbrella of the sense of state. Of course, we must thank a party like the PSOE, fought in these responsible leaders, that it is so pristine about what is the common house of our homeland bourgeoisie. But so much affected gesticulation already seems like pure comedy, the vacations of the deputies and the pipelines of the Sir Fari Simon on the Portuguese coast in the middle of the second wave of the pandemic, unfortunately, or, likewise, the fact that respectable constitutional bodies such as the CGPJ have been pending 2 years of renewal due to lack of political will indicate that, in the background, the PSOE has more reason than it would like. The lesson is the surface and redundancy of the parliamentary liberal paraphernalia for the maintenance of the new normal, in which, in the face of consensus, the autopilot mode is opening up, with all the social discipline and exercise of the military muscle that accompanies it already put to the test during the spring confinement, with the essential collaboration of the Gestapo of the balcony, and which now comes from the release of new and sanitary measures such as the curfew. Thus, bluntly, whether in the subway, in the 3,000 homes, or in the squatted industrial warehouse of Badalona, the overcrowding of the proletarians does not weigh on the balance of profitability and the incessant reproduction of capital, guaranteed by the disciplinary apparatus of the imperialist state. The virus does understand classes. While the Minister of Health and his fellow pigs stick a guadec with Pedro Jota, the dispossessed masses face uncertainty and impoverishment every day and, as if that were not enough, the accusatory finger that blames them, for irresponsible, of the lack of control of the pandemic. The gazetilleros of all currents spend the day discussing whether Ayuso is a magnificent manager or an unbalanced psychopath, but they conveniently silence the exclusive third. The commitment that all the representatives of the bourgeoisie have acquired with the maintenance at full capacity of the machinery of capital at all costs, and that the only responsibility lies with the system as a whole. The new normal, like the old one, is based on the closure of ranks around the board of directors of the bourgeoisie, around the imperialist state and, in particular, around its military stamp. Bad times for the sweet songs with consensus. And if someone has been overwhelmed by the imposition of reason, of state, the only political logic that the bourgeoisie can conceive, it has not been so much the schizophrenic Casado as Sanchez's travel companions. It is a genuine irony of history that Unidas Podemos has taken the long-awaited ministerial portfolios just when the political cycle that gave birth to her closes. And this has been decisive for a remarkably carefree party for cementing any organic link with the mass movement that served as its basis, because now, at the time to shine, it has found itself an orphan of the springs that would allow it to impose its agenda in the coalition government. While it has been alienating itself from one of the central poles of modern politics, the mass movement, the other, the sense of state, has been imposed on Podemos as the supreme criterion. Thus, one by one, UP has been discarding, in its brief career of government, those poor elements that were still on its plebeian political identity card, but that threatened to obstruct the opinions of that sense of state that provides them with the frameworks of the possible, from voting against the publication of the facts of the terrorist Billy El Niño to refusing to investigate Mr. X for the gals. UP has even renounced its poor objectives of purifying the institutions under the premise that it would distract from the important. And this is not to mention taking advantage of the framework of the PP's labor reform to implement the ERTE facilitating collective layoffs, or that of the gag law for the systematic work of repression during confinement. Or the greeting of the vice, once an enemy of the caste, to the canavist virtues that the president of the PP wore before the motion of censure of Vox. The collapse of the Purples in the Basque and Galician autonomous elections was the last milestone, for the moment, of the crisis and collapse of the benchmark of state reformism. And, if we listen to the explanation that the bourgeoisie itself uses to understand the rise and debacle of up, perhaps we can draw some lesson of interest to our class. Under the heading of populism, commentators of all colors lament the end of the era of the old-fashioned parties, with territorial settlement and a solid internal bureaucracy densely intertwined with the bureaucracy of the post-Franco state, a bond that precisely came to criticize opportunism and, with it, Podemos. These would have been replaced by a new model of a caudalista party, in which the consultation of the base replaces the militant link and the main means of framing becomes the punctual street mobilization, as exemplary happens in the 8M-, in the face of a more permanent and internal link, if you can be said so. That would be the new policy that Podemos brought and whose path was followed by the PSOE, by Ciudadanos, the Pages, and by Vox. Well, without the need to share the terms or explanations of liberal politics, the unions, for example, have had little to do with a militant bond for decades. It is right to point out the intimate connection between the crisis of the state and the erosion of the traditional political party model. And Podemos enters the scene precisely appealing, consciously or unconsciously, to the reframing of citizen sickness directly from the state, from the reform expressed as a program. The speed with which Iglesias reached the vice president's chair has an inverse relationship with UP's efforts to secure his mass base systematically. The irony and the lesson is that direction of the state, precisely because it is a direction, requires a subject to set the objective, that it mediates between the directed and where to direct them. That depositary of subjectivity is none other than the political party, bourgeois in this case, but perfectly comparable in its form, not in its content, to the Communist Party. It is also true for the bourgeois parties that the whole essence of the issue lies in the intermediaries, and Podemos situated himself by trying to STO a reformist program without the proper partisan support that would allow him to settle and capitalize politically on the meager conquests that could be derived from it. The failure of Podemos speaks to us of the inability of the old-style working party, even in its postmodern variant, no longer to start the revolution, but even to settle as a new independent political force in the imperialist state. It was the one who traditionally played that role, the Liberal Workers' Party of a lifetime, the PSOE, who has benefited the most from that incapacity, dictating the rhythms and terms to his partners and, also, to his loyal opposition. But something remains, the total disarticulation of the mass movement from which it emerged, the 15M, and the transfer of its forms, means and dynamics to the other side of the bourgeois political spectrum. The Cayetana revolt that hit the streets in May expresses that same transfer of operational and logical modes traditionally belonging to the left that we already examined in the U.S. The Borgamari of the Salamanca neighborhood demonstrating against social communist liberticide, on foot or in Mercedes, has gone to settle in the void left by the end of the political cycle of 15M. Not only is it that the street no longer belongs only to the left, but that Vox has taken from Podemos the capitalization of indignation, empirical evidence that the crisis of representation is far from closed. With this impulse, this summer has been entrusted with the creation of an independent union of the PSOE and the left, Młodzieżowa Solidarność, an evident nod to the ultra-reactionary Polish Solidarność. What the Green Party has seen is that the flight of union work depends, precisely, on its link with an ideological political movement to the offensive, and that this is the decisive spring for the union to become a transmission belt of an alternative policy. It is that, to begin with, Vox does count, unlike revisionism, with the political social entities generated, precisely, in spheres very far from the union, as Podemos did at the time, and the ideological discourse capable of making its mass organisms struts of an alternative project to progressive dictatorship. Abascal's party, which certainly does not lack the smell of class, seems to have taken good note of the lessons of the Podemos failure and has rushed to organize the impetus of the mass movement, building bridges so that the state of opinion against the social communist government translates into the organization of the mass base on which Vox maneuvers. Secondly, the union is a matter of state, exactly to the same extent as gender policy and other flagships that today make up the navy of social consensus. But, unlike these, the union and the class it represents, the working class aristocracy, are immediately overdetermined by the recent past, the dismantling of the welfare state in which this class fully participated in the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie as a reactionary dominant class. Since the neoliberal restructuring of the imperialist state, that quota had to be reluctantly shared with other social movements. As is known, nothing is scarce like crumbs dash, and this disembarrassed class was developing its own ideological discourse to vindicate its old exclusivist privileges. It included reindustrialization, economic sovereignty, coined with a more or less undisguised chauvinism, and the denunciation of the yellowing of the large unions as the axes of the programs of the vast majority of what was to the left of the PSOE, from the opportunists' PCEIU to the last revisionist group. Today, that identity discourse is carried out by the far right, and with greater dexterity than revisionism. In the same way that Podemos, in its day, evidenced the uselessness of the red paraphernalia to put themselves at the head of the spontaneous movement, Vox appropriates the opportunistic criticism of vertical trade unionism selling workers to build, in turn, its own mass organisms in a genuine process of accumulation of forces. Contrasting to this, as the PCTE, the PCOE, or the Workers' Front do, the class and combative unionism it signs, whose content is none other than the reduction of the communist to trade unionist and the liquidation of the new type Workers' Party as the axis of the revolution, not only obstructs the elevation and revolutionary education of the vanguard, but also confines it to giving the battle in the same terrain as social reformism and the ultra-right, that is, and the institutions that naturally exercise the link of the bourgeois state with the spontaneous movement, such as the Union or the Workers' Party of Old Guy. At a time when the threat of social decomposition that permanently flies over capitalism is intensified, the conceptions and tools of the working class with a consciousness itself prove themselves as a solid space in the face of the liquid social maelstrom, with its own traditions and corporate institutions. In turn, its fundamental dependence on the state, and the state is the ideal collective capitalist, according to Engels, makes it extremely sensitive to the shocks it experiences, and, for the same reason, it forms as an easily mobilized layer. If we add to this the era of imperialist repositioning in which we find ourselves, with its chauvinist fervors, we have in it all the ingredients for the cooking of a fascist mass movement. It is still to be seen that Vox is able to pilot this process, among other things because of the national Catholic tradition of fascism in these lands, or because of its, for now, profession of liberal faith. But when before this prospective opportunism promotes the cult of the average worker, the tactic process of accumulating forces in the union, the state as an axis of social transformation and, increasingly, the blatantly chauvinist prejudices, red or tricolor, which have been the same. Then, opportunism, we say, contributes to the articulation of fascism in the Spanish state, collaborating in the construction of the political and ideological wicker that make up the architecture of the reactionary mass movement, when not directly opposing for the future flesh of Freikorps. And we are not referring only to those who have surrendered, lush, to dispute Spain on the right. It is that this social fascist character is consubstantial to all opportunism, the last line of defense of the bourgeois regime, and historically inevitable since the emergence of the new type Workers' Party as a superior form of classist union of the proletarians, Lenin. The reconstruction tactic, or communist unity, again in vogue in recent times, is presented and defended, openly, as the last lifeline of the domination of capital. Look, if not, at the Proletarian Union. His strategists perform the healthy exercise of reviewing the brilliant curriculum vitae of his past experiments by the unit. 16. Anyone might think that such a trajectory would lead these jugglers to rethink their burned tactics. But no. Opportunism stumbles 80 times on the same stone and, after its recent unitary steps with the Communist Initiative, the PCE, ML, Red, and the PCPE, reveals to us the content of its new cavalcade for the unity of the communists. We consider that the communists must support the current government with the participation of petty bourgeois democracy, not because it is going to lead us to socialism, but because the alternative now possible is an even more reactionary government than the last one headed by M. Rajoy, which would make the workers' and democratic struggle even more difficult. Let's finish. It's about safeguarding the person in charge of safeguarding the bourgeois state. We can finally answer the question posed by Alan Moore in his famous comic book series, Who Watches the Watchmen? Proletarian Union. For its part, the PCOE, which never loses the opportunity to insist on the fascist character of the Spanish state and confirms the general discredit of parliamentarism in its superficial analysis of the regional elections of July, does not cut a hair in defending its participation in them to reach the workers and organize them. And, if we go to the programmatic framework emanating from its brand new process of unity with the PCPE, we find the company cell as the germ of what will be the Popular Workers' Front for Socialism and, also, of the power organs of the working class, embryos of the future socialist and working class state. Do not expect the reader to find what plan the dynamic duo will follow to get from the Union Commission and the collective agreement to the organs of the new power. But it's not necessary either. The elections and the works councils, to which the PCOE lavishes a worship bordering on the fetish, are well worth organizing the workers. Or it may even be that the autonomous communities, which both fetishists pressure to guarantee a safe return to school. Is there a more shameless way to educate workers in rigorous submission and respect for the institutions of the bourgeoisie? The PCTE is not left behind. In the political report approved by the 10th plenary of its Central Committee, the government's policy during confinement is denounced as functional to monopoly capital, and charges against the ERTE, the minimum vital income, and the union leadership. However, the following is the role played by thousands of trade unionists and delegates in information and advice on the situation in companies as a result of the ERTE, because it facilitated that hundreds of thousands of workers had minimal guidelines. That is, this policy and its promoters are condemned as lackeys of capital. But those responsible for carrying it out and leading the proletariat to the red of the imperialist state are congratulated and commended. Like its former party colleagues, the PCTE can only conceive of the revolution as the transfer of the state machinery, including the mastodon of the union bureaucracy, into its hands, educating its acolytes in the strict observance of its rights and protocols. And, given this, is it surprising that he doesn't see anything in the Vox Union more than a picket of the employers? Incapable of any class analysis, this prodigal son regrets that Abascal's party is helping to naturalize reactionary positions and attitudes. Go! Will the PCTE join the postmoderns to teach the workers to deconstruct those nefarious attitudes? Or will he exercise in materialism to surprise himself by fighting for the same base of masses, the working class aristocracy, as the far right? It is an axiom of that philosophical school that must be sought the reason for consciousness in the social being, but this would inexorably lead to finding the root of the reactionary attitudes of the syndicated worker in his practice as a class, in his spontaneous movement, and in the forms of organization that are his own. But, of course, that is a step that narrow practicism, for its own good, is not willing to take. A revolutionary vaccine for times of uncertainty. All this is nothing more than the evidence of the necessary reactionary outcome of the spontaneous movement and spontaneousism in the vanguard. The other notorious example is in feminism, mother of the lamb of the ideas of the ruling class in our time. Of course, the position of revolutionary Marxism regarding this is that of a sworn enemy, and there is no need to insist that the defeat of the bourgeois women's movement is, as a century ago, one of the main tasks of the communists, and in this issue of Línea Proletaria the reader will be able to find a more contribution of our movement to the fight against it, in particular against the incoherent attempts to paint it red. However, and given that lately revisionism is formally detaching itself from class feminism, without self-criticism in sight that is accountable for that turn, it may be useful to point out some lesson in this regard, and that red feminism, now blushed, refuses to see. Feminism, to become the gigantic mass-framing machinery that it is today, has itself gone through a whole process of, in its own way, ideological and political constitution, from the elaboration of its own theory, which, despite all its nuances, variations and surnames, invariably revolves around gender as an axis from which to understand the social question, to its inclusion in the programs of the overwhelming majority of the parties of liberal democracies as a matter of state and through a whole cohort of experts duly promoted to the different levels of the system of political domination of the bourgeoisie, imposing its terms and conceptual frameworks as the new common sense. And that's the core of the matter. At the same time, feminism is opportunism in the face of the issue of women and, as such, a breeding ground for the same ultra-trends that we have already been able to trace in the reformist labor movement. Parity policies, cancel culture, the excesses of their representatives, the demand for more and better state or blatant punitivism are the demagogic beams of the same corporate common sense on which the far right is politically nourished. And the evident realization that the policies of social reformism do not even protect women can only result in the progressive strengthening of a state of opinion favorable to authoritarian solutions and free of the prejudices of their progressive counterparts. A year ago, Vox boasted of being the true defender of women by advocating for reviewable permanent imprisonment or the immediate deportation of immigrants prosecuted for sexual assault. Whoever has ears to understand, who understands? If the vanguard aspires to recover the proletariat as an independent subject, that is, to reconstitute communism, it is an unavoidable task to break with the feminist dogmas and the power police culture that they promote. This political culture, which universally infects all bourgeois currents, including, of course, revisionism, is frontally opposed to the perspective and style of work of revolutionary communism, whose axis is ideology and its tactics plan. This is the main reason why revisionism and its lilac cretinism charged, and will charge against the LR. It is indifferent to opportunism if the oppression of women is due to the inessable patriarchy, class society, or an anti-scientific medley of both. For him, unlike for us, theoretical questions are a mere nominalist problem that in no way affects the practice of going to the tail of the bourgeois women's movement. What is really at stake is gender separatism and the culture of the statement. The trending topic and the personal is political, in which even personal quarrels and gossip are politicized. It is evident, for everyone free of prejudice, the precariousness of any attempt to build universality on such a sandbox. And this is frontally opposed to the style of work and the avant-garde political culture that the LR aspires to recover as genuine communist common sense. That this is not an easy task can be witnessed by those young study circles that break with revisionism in pursuit of an authentic revolutionary alternative. Over the last few months, several detachments that aimed the reconstitution of communism were publicly presented in the Mexican state. The comrades of the Red Flag Collective, BR, New World Collective, NM, and Proletaria Fight Union, ULP, have the undoubted merit of struggling to open, for the first time outside the shell of the Spanish state, a space dedicated to the substantive tasks of the avant-garde, and taking as an example the still modest path already traveled by the LR, today aimed at the construction of the Marxist-Leninist vanguard reference. Naturally, we are filled with internationalist pride to see that, indeed, what it proposes is universal and capable of making the conscious proletarians of another corner of the world feel questioned. So we can only publicly and enthusiastically greet the initiative taken by the comrades. In this issue of Línea Proletaria, we have been kind enough to incorporate the most noteworthy passages of the propaganda texts that have been published there, and that the reader will be able to find in full on their respective web pages. However, this internationalist greeting would not be complete without the indispensable revolutionary vigilance. To this end, we accompany the fragments with a critical presentation, but it is also possible to insist here on a particular aspect according to feminism. BR's extensive text of criticism of the blind well of the PCM, which NM subscribes as an important, serious step towards the balance of the issue of women, evidences that enormous weight that feminism still has on the avant-garde. Apart from the fact that neither the terrain nor the tactic chosen by BR for this battle seem appropriate to us, the comrades by much of the star concepts of the bourgeois women's movement, such as gender violence, page 43, the Federiciano unpaid reproductive work of women, p. 29, or the contempt for femininity, page 51. Without already entering into its more than questionable use by the Marxists, we will limit ourselves to interrogating the comrades about the place to which they are going with the appropriation of these terms, to the ideological independence of the proletariat and the construction of the avant-garde, or, on the contrary, to its submission to the feminist theoretical framework and the dilemmas of the bourgeois women's movement. If proletarian feminism has any meaning, that is no other K-feminism as a bourgeois political program of reform and proletarian as a subordination of the class to it, in this case, of its vanguard. The involuntary slip of the comrades towards this muddy puddle testifies how in our time of absence of revolutionary certainties, reactionary certainties, in this case feminist, take their place quite naturally. It corresponds to the field that raises the rearmament of the proletariat, a field in which Mexican collectives are located, fight against traditional phraseology, angles, and recover the beams of the revolutionary conception of the world, of Marxism, starting with the balance of the October cycle. Without it, the normality that surrounds us, whether old or new, but equally reactionary in all its dimensions, can only impose itself on those who think of the revolution and subject them to possibility, reconciliation, and desertion. The latter is the case, and returning to the Iberian aerial, of the exemplary sample of this climate of demoralization and liquidationism generously titled Critique of a Theology of the Revolution, published in early summer. There will already be an opportunity to settle accounts with the seriousness and rigor that characterize the LR, but for the moment we will limit ourselves to being pleased that the plan to rearm revolutionary communism is disturbing in a sphere such as the ranks of bourgeois liberalism, in this case in its university column. And if we qualify said libello as liberal, we do it in a double sense. Indeed, it is liberal in the conventional sense of the term for its ideological content, full of anti-communist commonplaces typical of any reactionary pamphlet of the last 2 centuries. The LR is totalitarian, page 30, subjectivist, page 11, dogmatic, page 26, a poorly disguised theology, pages 2, 30, 32, that divinizes revolution and violence, pages 33 to 34. And it is also in the sense that Mao gave him in his well-known booklet. Because what is behind this panegyric about the goodness of criticism and against the roller of praxis, and also openly, is the resignation of the bourgeois intellectual to the revolution and the vital commitments it entails. It is only because of this anti-Bolshevik coherence that we agree that it is a complete criticism, page 3, which calls without half measures to the liquidation of all the strategic elements that make up communism as a civilizational alternative, from the integral conception of the world, Engels, Lenin and its update through the balance sheet, to the new type Workers' Party. They take what is a subjective result of the class struggle, the defeat of the proletariat and the subsequent climate of demoralization and defeatism, only as an objective fact, as a truth that metaphysically they come to discover or unveil. They admonish the LR for presenting ideally a priori the system of reality before it has been given as such, page 28, referring to the new orientation. And, indeed, only those who are towing the events, painting gray on the canvas of a world that cannot rejuvenate, can reproach conscious proletarians who want to give earthly body to the plans that they have projected ideally a priori in their head. Will this be the reason for their aversion to the Marxist category of work? This is the dirty bond that has historically united opportunism in the labor movement, and modern revisionism, with the liberal bourgeoisie, the prudent invitation, or critical, so much for the workers to settle for what bourgeois normality immediately puts them at their fingertips, be it the union, be the criticism, last bastion of resistance before the tyrannical force of capital, or the critical synthesis of both in the befront universal basic income. Endure the laugh, we're done. By the way, few lessons of criticism can be given to the LR, which has emerged from the revolutionary criticism of revisionist schematism, contrasting it with the effective and real revolution as it was deployed in the October cycle. But, in fact, if something is missed in this task, it is precisely a greater systematization of the results of the balance sheet, and all the more so in a moment of general theoretical dispersion in which the proletariat needs to recover its integral conception of the world, because the communists, unlike others, do not have behind them an institution like the academy that provides them with their theoretical consciousness. Reducing the revolution to an uncertain, narrow, and informal critical disposition is, plainly, liquidationism. The thing about these gentlemen is not the imminent criticism of the new orientation, but the retreat to the criticalist and individualistic positions that are fought in it and the dismystification of dialectics to make it a formalistic and syllogistic reasoning. Stalin said that the party is not a debate club. Likewise, the LR is not a coffee tertulia nor, as our sagacious critics want to show, an organon for the contemplative knowledge of the world. The LR is the strategic and universal plan for the transformation of that world and, as Marxism of our day, the theory of the conditions of the emancipation of the proletariat and humanity. Other than that, it expects nothing more than the overwhelming slavery of capital and, probably, its own end as a species in the last imperialist war or in the environmental collapse. And there will always be some critic who, cynically, whispers in his ears that rebelling against that destiny is totalitarianism, violence, or a runaway hybris. So be it. Committee for Reconstruction, December 2020.